Hey everybody, Andrew Davidson here, back with another video. Today I'm joined with a special guest actually. It's another Davidson is joining me. So today in this video I have my actual, literal, for real brother, Alex Davidson with me. Hey Alex.
Hey.
And so today we're going to be discussing together basically narratives and narratives kind of around war games or games in general. For those of you that kind of watch my show, you know that I kind of started the channel to be about how games can be interpreted, how they can be used. And so my brother Alex is a writer. He's in California. He'll probably talk about himself in a moment. But I just asked him on to basically just kind of have a talk about story narratives. We're going to be talking about games. We're going to be talking about role-playing games. We're just kind of going to go wherever the conversation goes. So as I said, Alex is out in California, so it's the middle of the night here for me, and it's evening time for you. So Alex, anything you want to say about yourself?
Andy's my brother, or Andrew. Take your pick, I guess. I am in California, been out here about 6 years. I'm from North Dakota originally. I studied filmmaking and writing, specifically screenwriting. So I've always wanted to be a writer since I was probably in like elementary school. And then I transitioned towards film in middle school, and that's what I've always been passionate about, interested in, specifically narrative of all types. So how narrative is involved from, games as well as, replays, novels, anything. I just find the narrative form really fascinating. But specifically, I think film for myself is the medium, and I also direct as well. So that's a big thing for me, and I'm out here pursuing that. I'm finishing up my first feature film, which I wrote, directed, and produced. We're about 2/3 of the way through filming, but we kind of got delayed with this coronavirus stuff, so we're waiting for that to all clear up so we can finish the film. And that's about it. Excited to talk about some narrative and gaming stuff.
Yeah, for those of you who don't know, Alex kind of spoiled it. We are currently in the 2020 coronavirus pandemic, I guess. And so what is your film about? Just tell everyone, give it a little plug, I guess.
It's called Spirit of Fear. It's a psychological thriller horror, I guess you could say. And it's the basic, I guess, hook is it's about a guy who wakes up in a house, normal suburban house in the middle of the night, doesn't remember anything, doesn't know who he is, where he is, what's going on. Starts exploring the house, starts finding sticky notes around the house with little phrases on them, such as like, don't stay in this room very long, don't go outside, don't go downstairs. So he's trying to figure out what's going on, what do these notes mean. He realizes that he wrote the notes, but he has no memory of writing these notes to himself. And then there's a demonic presence in the house that starts growing stronger, and basically the demonic presence is trying to get out and consume him while he's trying to figure out these clues and, kind of follow this puzzle to figure out what's going on and how to get out of it. So that's kind of the basic plot.
Cool. And so I've been, I guess what I would consider an amateur writer for at least 10 plus years, if not more. And I know, as Alex said, he's been writing for a while. We've both, as brothers, have been interested in narrative in some way or another. Alex kind of went into the film. That's where he feels that like he has kind of a knack for telling stories. I've been more of the actual prose, writing short form stories and stuff like that. None of us really hit poetry.
I do a little bit.
We'll leave that to someone else. I'm not the poet.
Yeah, I used to do more poetry when I was in like middle school and like high school, but I kind of dropped off. I've kind of I tried to pick it up a bit more lately, actually. I'm not very good at it though.
Yeah, I can't write poetry. I do enjoy it. I do appreciate it as an English major, and someone had to study some of that. I do have some of my favorite poems, but we're both writers. I enjoy and consume a lot of narrative through books, musicals, plays, movies, and especially more germane to what we're talking about because we're on my channel right now is board games. So board games is something that I've studied. Well, narrative, I should say, narrative games, something that I studied in my academia, like my school career, and something that I looked at. And so we're going to just be talking about just stories and narratives and things like that, and kind of relating it around board games. And we'll just kind of see where it goes. So where I want to start off with, Alex, is just kind of a very broad question, and then we can kind of limit it down. So what makes like for good narrative in any medium, really? So what are some of the like universal things that you think need to be in good stories?
Yeah. So this is my take on it. There's obviously a lot of different varying opinions on things, but for myself, when I'm constructing narrative, whatever form it's going to be in, the first thing that I tend to look at is thematic, theme. So when I say theme, I don't mean like, oh, it all takes place in space. That's not a theme, that's a setting. What I mean more is like the idea of what the story is about at its core. So for example, you could say that it's like in a sentence. You can sum it up in a sentence. And it's not like, for example, like good versus evil is not a theme, but good wins out over evil because the good guys are willing to be more violent than the bad guys. That's a theme. That's something that you try to prove through your narrative and through the characters and how they explore the world and go through the plot. And good storytelling has at its core on every level the theme of the story in mind. So the characters are designed around the type of theme. The plot sequences, the action is designed to progress the idea of the theme. Within the characters, you have foils who are the antithesis of the theme. So everything works together harmoniously to try to either prove the theme, I guess you could say. And in any narrative, the better way to prove a theme is to try to disprove it. See, that's where they always say the best villain or the best heroes are the ones that are pitted against the best villains, because the villain is the opposite of the hero. In the same way, you want to have the opposite viewpoint of the theme. If your entire story is constructed around trying to prove the idea, but you don't show any counterpoint to it, you're not really proving anything, right? So that's for me, narratively, that's what I always look at, whether it's a book that I'm reading, play, a movie, TV series, anything. I think the strongest storytelling we have in our society deals with some sort of thematic element, and it permeates every level of the story.
Can you give us a quick off the top of your head example of a movie that's got a great theme?
And it's always very subjective because you can define different
Of
themes.
course.
Different people can define different themes, right? But you could say something as simple as like Finding Nemo, right? Could have the theme of the love of a father knows no boundaries, and then the film sets out to show that idea, so that's a pretty simple one. And you could also define other themes for that movie too, but that would be one that I think you could look at and look at points in the movie and go, yeah, that theme kind of permeates the entirety of the story and the characters and all that too.
One I always think of is I think of Into Darkness, which is a Star Trek film, which is like about family. I think being the theme, it's a theme about people that aren't necessarily your blood family, but they are still like your family.
Oh yeah, definitely, and that's a good point too. I mean, a quick reference on that for those who have seen the movie. Khan is the opposite end of the spectrum from Kirk, right? Because they both care so deeply about their crew as their family, as their constructed family. But Khan has gone, obviously, the dark path that can lead of doing terrible things because of his family, whereas Kirk goes the opposite of doing incredibly heroic and noble things for his family, right? So that's a cool idea, again, of that foil that they did with the characters regarding the theme.
Yeah, that's a good one. So that was kind of broad, I suppose. So let's talk more about like games specifically. This could be role-playing games, tabletop games, board games, legacy games, any type of like narrative storytelling games like that. Do any of these things that you're talking about or elements, do they share the same qualities like for tabletop games? So in other words, what a good narrative for this medium is a good narrative for this medium, or is there kind of a nuance there?
Yeah, and every time you look at a different medium for storytelling, there's different rules and different strengths and weaknesses. So film is great at showing action. You know, it's a lot more cool to watch an action sequence of a character doing things in a physical space on a movie than it is reading the description of it in a book. And there's obviously more you can do in a movie than you could do on a stage play, for example. Whereas like books can get inside a character's head. You can know what are they thinking, what are their internal thoughts. Can't do that with a play or with a movie very well. Stage plays can do dialogue super well because you have characters in one setting interacting with each other, face to face. So everything has its own strengths and weaknesses. I think that there's a lot of space within gaming in general for narrative, and I think we as humans always crave narrative no matter what. It's equipment for living, basically. So we always, really are attracted to that. I guess I'll reference a few things. One is I think there are certain gaming styles that are better for narrative than others, particularly when you're able to give characters or the players choice. And I mean choice within the narrative. So RPG games are, the D20 tabletop type games are a great example of that. That's actually, I don't know if you remember, but one of the first times I really got into narrative, I guess, or a big push for me getting into narrative was actually like D&D and Star Wars role-playing game, which you introduced me to when we were younger. And I started playing with some of my friends and stuff in middle school. And I was always the DM or the game master to facilitate the storytelling. I really love that aspect. I love, leading my players through this narrative, and I liked constructing the narrative and interacting with their choices as we went through the game. And kind of, I think that's where the strength of gaming can come from. Video games is another, I know that's not what this is about. This is about tabletop, but video games also are another platform of gaming that has a lot of potential for storytelling. I think on an equal level almost with movies at times. Because again, the player has choices that they can make interacting with a story. You can decide where the narrative goes, what kind of choices are being made. So that's very different from watching a movie or a book or anything else like that. And so that's a very unique thing that gaming can offer through the narrative that you don't get through other mediums. So I would say that there's a lot of potential within gaming for narrative. And I think that some games utilize it better than others. I think one of the challenges is to balance the mechanics with the thematics and the choices the character makes. So for example, if your game is centered around a lot of mechanics and the story is a byproduct of that, and it's kind of like, well, we're just going to put it in this setting and give it kind of a loose idea of what you're trying to do, but it's really more about the mechanics, and that's fun too. I love games. I play a lot of games myself, tabletop and whatnot. But at the same time, I think if you're looking for a narrative, if you want the strongest narrative, what you need to do is put the player in a place where they can make a choice regarding the theme. So they get to choose what kind of person they are in a sense. And you need to give people strong choices in that. So I don't have a great example off the top of my head, but just from a video game that I've played, like Mass Effect, at the end of the games, you get to choose how does the universe go? Do you restart the universe? Do you destroy it? Do you kind of reset everything back to the status quo? And that says something about the thematic within the game, as well as you as a player as well. You get to learn about yourself. What kind of choices do you lean towards? How do you see those kind of choices, good and evil, all that kind of stuff? But I think that, like I said, this from a game design standpoint, the more that a game designer can put thematics into the story and then put the choices the character or the player makes more regarding the theme, the stronger that narrative is going to feel within the game, and less mechanical.
Yeah, and that's all got to tie back into the gameplay too, because when you marriage the gameplay and the theme, that's when you really hit a good sweet spot. It's like, why are we just pushing these cubes around? Well, we have to give it meaning, right? These cubes have meaning. I can tell you that this cube's name is Joe, and I can put it in my mouth or whatever, and everyone freaks out. Why? Because it's like, you just put Joe in your mouth. It's just a cube, so you have to give things some meaning. But I do agree with you. There is a designer that I was listening to. I can't name drop right now because I don't remember who it was. But what they were talking about, I'm totally going to misquote them, so this is totally paraphrased. They were saying that games, good narrative games, just to kind of parody off of you, not only give players choices, but they give them meaningful choices. And I remember meaningful was kind of italicized or whatever, like, because you can have a lot of games where there's like, do you take door A or door B, but it doesn't matter in the end, really. It's just like, it's the illusion of this autonomy or like these choices or whatever have to be meaningful. So when you make these choices, if you pick door B, your gameplay is going to be significantly different, because again, we want to marry the theme and the mechanics as far as like, oh, well, now we're doing this. And so those have to be really strong in board games that tell stories. However, I'm going to throw out one thing, not in any disagreement, but just something recently that I've enjoyed, I guess, and I've been playing through a series which I have behind me called The Legends of Andor. And in The Legends of Andor, it's kind of like Lord of the Rings. It's a fantasy game that's got three movies, so to speak, three boxes with scenarios inside of each box. So it's like you're playing through skirmishes through movie 1, movie 2, movie 3. So it feels like a trilogy, and it follows that trilogy formula. I think you know what I mean when I say the trilogy formula. Like, the second one is always darker, the love connections are always strengthened, the bad guys are always feeling much more like heavy, and it follows that story. However, players along the way can, if this is the narrative, they can kind of nick it a little this way or a little this way, but it's, in a sense, it's kind of linear. It's like you can have a little bit of choice here, whether if you have this sword or if you have that sword, or if you save this person, or if you save that person, but it's still headed towards an ending trilogy. Like I said, it's 3 games, and it's a really good story. I really like it. So I don't know, what would you think of that? I mean, there are ideas and ways to just have, like, let's just have one really good story and not worry about all these branching narratives. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that there's different levels that they can be on. Like I said, I think the hardest part, in my estimation, with the game design aspect of it, is marrying, the strength of the theme, the choices, and the gameplay. The mechanics, the actual, meat of playing the game. Because you can lose your theme in the mechanics, because then, like I said, players start to just focus on that, and they're not really thinking about the thematics. Again, if you face a character with a choice, and one thing I want to clarify is when I talk about choice of a character or a thematic choice, it can't be like, well, do you pick good or do you pick bad, right? It has to be something that's more of an actual dramatic choice. Because a choice between good and evil is never really a choice. I mean, everyone knows in their head, well, of course you're going to pick good, or you should pick good, right? We all know that kind of intrinsically. But a choice between the lesser of 2 evils or the greater of 2 goods, that's an actual choice, because there's not really a clear decision to make. So, for example, I mean, Spider-Man, movie where you have, do you save the love of your life or do you save the bus full of innocent children? You can only pick one. What do you pick? That's an actual choice. So that's what I mean in games, getting characters to focus on the choices in a thematic sense and as a character within the actual game versus the mechanics of it. Of going, well, if I pick the love of my life, that will mean that this happens in the game, or it'll send me down this path in the game. Mechanically, they start to think meta about the game, right? That's, I think, a challenge. I don't know how you overcome that one, because when people are playing a game, they know they're playing a game. They're not sucked into it as much. I think RPGs have kind of found a good way around that, at least tabletop ones, because I think you're thinking a little bit less mechanically, a little bit more in terms of your character, because you're trying to play a character. Whereas like a board game or a video game, you're kind of playing more for the mechanics in a certain sense. What you're playing a game. I think that you can have games that have fewer decision trees like you're talking about, and they can still be very strong as long as you ground those choices, like I said, an actual dramatic choice of the lesser of 2 evils or the greater of 2 goods is always a good way to kind of phrase it. And again, relating it back to the theme of the game of what is it you're trying to say about the world? What's that sentence that you constructed about why this story is a story? Why are we engaging in the story? What's the use of it? What's it about? But right. I think that, like RPGs could give you much wider trees of, decision trees you can go down that'll influence the game. And that's also really fun. I don't think that you need to do one or the other. I think there should be space for both.
Yeah, so kind of going back to what I said, just kind of reiterating with like theme in the board game world is all about, what are you doing in the game? What is the game about? And there's that perfect marriage of narrative and theme, because when something comes along and you have certain beats in your narrative, you want the game to reflect that. So things will constantly change or be changing in the game mechanically to meet the narrative. So I do have a question here, but I do want to get a few things out before we move forward. So because you talked about the tabletop role playing experience, and so I want to get that just kind of out of the table, and then we can talk more about role playing stuff. There's been kind of a movement in the last however many years or so that's getting away from your typical real heavy pencil and paper um, D20 system, kind of D&D, Pathfinder, Shadowrun, things like that, and leaning more towards story. So designers are going, I think what people really want is they love story. And so they're developing these more storytelling heavy games than games where it's like +2, let's see, -1, but it's a pretty far jump. So the difficulty classes, and kind of doing this, what we would call bookkeeping in the gaming world, and then, we'll make a roll and we'll see how well you do or not. There's a lot of games that are going on like a pass-fail system. So I'm gonna bring up a game that I just reviewed on my channel quite a bit back called Weave. Weave is a game that you use. You have one person that is a storyteller that takes their phone and uses their phone to scan some cards. So the Weave gives you, I should have brought it. It's in the other room. It gives you these big tarot cards that are pretty cool, and you scan them, and they will kind of, depending on the play set that you pick, they will import certain themes, settings, that would be like locations, bosses, items, certain objects, and the storyteller can kind of morph his or her story off of that, of scanning them in. Character creation is the same way. They scan in some cards. It takes 5 minutes to make a character. But what they're doing is they're focusing more on the story, because when it comes to making choices in the story, it's pretty much a 4-tiered level, or 4-tiered system, where you have on one end, you have an epic pass, you have a pass, you have a fail, and you have an epic fail. So like an epic pass is you rolled extra than what you needed or something like that. That's an epic pass. So then the storyteller will give you a little more control over how do you want the resolution of this conflict or fight or whatever it may be to go. A pass would be, okay, you get what you want. The storyteller's going to kind of do what they want with the story. And then just the inverse of that. A fail is, the guy's not really going to listen to you. He's too busy like selling popcorn to these little kids. Or an epic fail would be you fall into the guy and knock over his whole popcorn stand, and now he's like really upset or whatever. That's really been the way that stories have been going in games, at least in storytelling tabletop RPG games, moving into that kind of a space where it's a little less, for all the D&D kids out there, like pushing up their glasses and like being nerdy about their +20 sword of this or that or whatever, and moving away from that and getting it is just a testament to how people crave, the humans just kind of crave stories, and they like stories, and it's much more accessible. Like I'm not praising Weave. I don't work for them. I don't make any money from them, but I like the idea that people are moving towards this more accessible way of, hey, you know what? You can make a character. You can scan some cards in your phone. It gives you a couple of choices of like, do you want to be this? You get like a flaw and whatnot. And boom, you're ready to go. It's right there on your phone. Your whole character sheet's right there, and it's very simplistic, and you can look up all your stuff. And it concentrates more on the storyteller just moving the story fast. So another one I'm going to throw out, which I have talked about, not really on the channel yet, because I haven't actually played it, is a game called Fiasco. Fiasco is a game that is a little more based, I feel kind of weird throwing this one out, because it's a little more based on the improvisational aspect of people. They develop relationships with the people that they're sitting next to based on this whole setup of dice and how you roll and what play set that you're playing. A play set, by the way, for people at home, is basically whatever thematic scene that you're going through. So like one is like a nightclub in the 70s, or another one could be a cowboy western. So you basically can just plug in all these play sets into Weave or into, well, Weave has 4 of them that are pre-made so far. And then Fiasco has quite a few books you can buy. It's been out for a while. And so you can look up, you want to do like a crime solving CSI one, they wrote a play set for that. And so you'll create these things and you'll create scenes with each other and kind of act out these scenes or role play these scenes, and it'll just develop the story. And then at some point, without going through step by step, this isn't a tutorial of how to play the game. You know, you hit a certain spot where you roll some dice and things kind of happen and change. It's a whole fiasco, right? The designers of it based it off of, they were inspired by every Coen Brothers movie. So they're really inspired by like something goes missing or some money's found or some body part is revealed. What's that?
Is it always a briefcase full of money, right?
A briefcase full of money. Well, they say it on the actual book that you buy to play the game. On the back, it does say that it's like, this game is inspired by like Fargo, Blood Simple, or whatever, like some of their movies and stuff like that. And so moving away from this pen and paper kind of thing and moving more towards, I need to have a really strong story. Why? Because that's all we really have. I mean, character upgrades and all that stuff is great. You know, the people do like love that. They love a plus 20 sword or whatever. But the accessibility of people just being like, I don't know how to do this. And it's like, it's fine. Just, it's done for you. It's so simple. It's so streamlined. And we can give a scene or we can act out things in Fiasco. And the book, tells us exactly what to do. Oh, halfway through the game, we roll a die and something will change. Characters will change. All of a sudden now I'm spiteful of the person to my right, on my right or whatever. And I think that these games, the reason why I'm pointing out these games and kind of leaning away from Dungeons and Dragons is because it places so much more importance on storytelling. And so the next area that I'm kind of wanting to talk about is like, as a writer, let's talk about being writers. Are narrative storytelling games like Weave or Fiasco, Dungeons and Dragons, or any other RPGs, are they good tools for writers to use to, master their craft? Or what about vice versa? What about the other way around? How do you feel?
Yeah, I think that's interesting. I think there's definitely space for writers to develop their craft or implement their craft for sure. Obviously, within gaming, there's narrative, and we've seen that develop in the video game world, which is a bit of a bigger industry than the board game world. But I mean, they have writers on a lot of stuff. If you play, again, going to an RPG game that has a big open world like Pillars of Eternity or something like that, which is kind of like a D&D equivalent. You could read books like just in the game, so somebody has to write all that. So I think, and somebody has to design the world and the characters and write all the dialogue for the characters. So there's definitely a lot of craft elements that you can implement into a game and that writers can be a part of. I would say it's going back to that different mediums have different strengths and weaknesses when it comes to how they tell a narrative. I think that's just the biggest thing to keep in mind for writers and for people designing games is that I think personally, the best strength that a game has is the aspect of choice, of letting somebody choose something, like a choose your own adventure book, It's like we all thought those were pretty fun when we were kids, but this is a much better vehicle for having a narrative and being able to choose where the narrative goes and the choices that get made. And I think it can be very cathartic for people because, like I said, you can actually kind of put yourself in a dangerous situation and see how maybe you might react or get you to think about how you might react without actually having to go through it. And that's one of the powers of storytelling. You can listen to the guy talking about killing the grizzly bear with his bare hands and kind of learn from that and experience it without actually having to experience it and go through the actual danger. So I think that the aspect of choice that you can give to players is the strength of the medium of gaming for storytelling. Whereas, like I said, action is for film, dialogue is for stage, internal thoughts, monologue is for books. I think gaming is really about choice, and being able to choose the narrative and choose where the narrative goes and the decisions that get made regarding the theme as well, like we talked about earlier.
And so, yeah, we talked about like some of the overlap with narrative things, narrative elements. You mostly touched on theme, maybe characters you could throw in there too. So like would creating a Weave campaign or a D&D campaign, because you played, like you said, would that be something that you could extrapolate, I guess, and use into a more of a like cinematic sense of these, building characters and stuff like that, and being like, hey, this campaign that we played, it could be a movie. We could have just made like a movie here. I could write a screenplay about this D&D campaign or whatever, Weave campaign or Fiasco, whatever.
Yeah, I think that's a hard one. Yes
You think
and
that would
no.
work?
Yes and no.
I know. I know at one point you said like dreams never work as movies. Don't
Right.
don't take your dream and make it into a movie. So how about this? How about don't take your D&D game and make it into a movie, or your Weave game, or what have you?
Yeah, I would say that's pretty fair advice. It's the same thing of like everyone says, oh well, the book was much better than the movie, right? Well, that's because it was designed as a book to to highlight the strengths of that form of storytelling, and then you take it and you put it into a different medium. It's not going to be able to explore the strengths that it was originally written in. Sometimes that can work. I mean, you have like Cormac McCarthy books that get translated into beautiful movies because he's a very cinematic writer. He doesn't really he does a lot of internal dialogue, but everything plays out very cinematic with his books. Even his dialogue that he writes, it's almost like a screenplay in a certain way. So it's not every case, and so I would say there are cases I think where you could take a D&D campaign and say that was really amazing, the twists and turns and the characters that all the players played and developed and everything like that, and the choices they made make a great movie. I think anytime you look at something like that though, or you read a book and you're like, this would make a great movie, you have to think of, well, it was great because of the medium that I experienced it in, and I have to find a way to make it great in this new medium now. So you can still take a lot of the same stuff and apply it to a movie, but it's going to have to change to fit the movie medium better than the board game medium, which is, like I said, more focused on the aspect of you get to make choices. Movies, you don't get to do that.
Right.
So I would say it's pretty sound advice to, like you were kind of mentioning with dreams, like it's so visceral and real to you when you have a dream that you're like, oh, that would be so amazing for other people to experience it, but then you put it into a movie and no one's ever going to experience it that way. It's kind of the same thing with the board game. No one watching a movie of your board game experience, if you turned it into a movie, is going to have the same experience as you actually being able to make those choices in the moment. And that's what gives it power, I think. That doesn't mean you can't develop some great narratives through gaming, especially like where it's more sandboxy, open worldy, like RPG games where you can kind of do whatever you want. There's fewer restrictions. You can develop some amazing narratives, but you're going to have to change the story, change the narrative to fit the filmmaking medium, and that's what always happens.
So what do you think is the best, I guess, if you're writing for let's say you're assigned a project and you're writing for a board game as opposed to writing for a movie, which you do, you have more experience with, do you approach it differently? I mean, obviously you look at the medium and go, how can we take these strengths and make them work in our tabletop game or like our legacy game or our movie?
Yeah,
how do you
like
approach
I said,
it differently?
I think that you have to approach it just in that the medium is different. I think a lot of the things that make storytelling great go across all the mediums. So you're still looking at it from the core perspective of thematics, how the thematics permeate the story, turning points, reversals of expectation, all these kind of tenets of good storytelling that are in books or in plays or in movies. That still applies to any story. Even if you're just telling somebody a story at the bar about your day, you can improve that story through the way you structure it. So I think story structure is still very important. Again, like I said, like turning points, reversals, building acts, and it'll look different with, different stories and different mediums, but like the 3-act structure is very popular in a lot of plays and a lot of movies. And that's a good framework, is to understand that any story is going to still have to apply structure to it, and that your thematics are part of that structure. How are you building the framework of the story? It all has to mean something and relate back to something and have a core. And the thematic, like I said, the theme is always a core for me of any story. But then you do have to look at it from the medium that you're telling the story in and go,
Yeah.
okay, how do I maximize the effectiveness of this medium? And that's, like I said, going back to that idea of choice, of how do I give players really good dramatic choices, not just, well, do you save the old lady or do you let the old lady die? I think that's not really a good choice, you know. But like I said, having to choose, do I save the person I love the most in the world, or do I save the bus full of innocent kids? That's an actual choice. And it makes people think about, you know, about what that means, you know, and it can be cathartic, and it can explore all these great things that stories can do for us. It can, like I said, it can kind of put us in that decision moment without actually introducing the real life danger, and kind of let us play it out, you know, act it out in a sense. So I think that's the main thing, is keeping the structure of storytelling intact, but then exploring what the medium has to offer that other mediums don't.
Yeah, one of the problems is when you tackle a project is you have to always look at its strengths, as you just talked about, and its limitations. So board games and movies, they all have great strengths and they have like great limitations. They're very different. For example, in the movie space, you would have limitations of like financial things, you know, budget, time, crew, just getting financial things ready, screenplays, getting a team, because it's a team thing, working as a team for a board game and coming up with a narrative. You have the limitations of what can we actually do with this cardboard, in a sense, you know, like I know I'm kind of getting away from the whole role-playing D20 type thing, but what are our limitations? What are our mechanics? Because as I said, you know, you and I are kind of going back and forth, just repeating ourselves. For me, game mechanics really have to match the story. When something happens in the story, something needs to happen in the gameplay, or else, like I said, we're just pushing cubes around. And it's like, okay, there's supposed to be a story here, but I don't really know the story. And so I'll give an example of a really great game that I thought that really did not understand its limitations, if you will. I know this is a lot of your zone. There's a game by Ryan Lockett, who I absolutely adore. So no hate comments. I love Ryan Lockett and his company, Red Raven Games. He puts out a lot of beautiful games. He does all his own work, artwork. He does all the writing. He does all the designing. He, just like Alex, he's involved in everything. He puts like everything together practically. And I played a narrative campaign of his called Near and Far. Now, Near and Far is a game where it's a storybook game where you're playing kind of on this book that has different chapters of your map of the world. And it's totally cool. It's great. But the story was not cohesive. So what he didn't really do, in my opinion, and no hate towards Red Raven Games or Near and Far, is that it just kind of came fragmented. Because as Alex already pointed out, choose your own adventure. Well, you got to be able to make sure that if you introduce a character, it comes at the right time. And if you mention something, that it has more to it than that or whatever. So basically what I'm trying to say is when I played Near and Far, played 10 games of it, I couldn't tell you a lick of what was going on because it was so fragmented of like, you hear stories of winds in the east or whatever. I'm making stuff up. Or you hear this, there's a big red dragon lady that pops up every once in a while or something like that. And there wasn't really any way for you to find those. I'm sure you could, but there was just so much out there that me and just one other player, we were just getting little snippets trying to just get through the game because it is a competitive game. So you are like, I just gotta do what I need to do. I gotta build this, I gotta make my points, I gotta go travel and like establish my camps and get my workers going and stuff like that. But then there's like this side thing,
Yeah,
which is the story. And so the limitations there are, you know, we could sit down, Alex and I could sit down and we could come up with a great choose your own adventure, sort of like snippets of stories here and here and here, but there's really no cohesive. There's no way to make it cohesive because your players have way too much autonomy. You think that that could be a problem? I mean, I've seen it be a problem.
Yeah, that's is that a problem? I think that goes back to one thing I mentioned earlier, which is the game mechanics can get in the way of the narrative and things can become meta, right? I play, as far as board games, I play a lot more competitive, player versus player games. I think you play a lot of different games, but you like the we're working together against the game itself games. I know that's kind of something that you like in your games.
Cooperative.
Yeah, more cooperative games. I'm more of a competitive person. I want to play against my friends and beat them. So that's the challenge of you can have a great game, a great narrative, again, giving players great choices regarding that narrative and the theme in the narrative. That if the player looks at that choice and sees nothing but a mechanical strategy of how am I going to win, how am I going to get the desired outcome, they're not really engaging in the story, then are they? So that's a challenge, is balancing the mechanics, and I don't know the answer to that one for games. But for example, like a game that I like a lot is Terraforming Mars. Not a great story in the game, but you do have different corporations. There's kind of an idea of, different corporations are trying to approach terraforming this planet in different ways. But when I'm playing a corporation, I'm not thinking of that. I'm just thinking of the mechanics that are allowing me to try to win the game that the corporation is offering me, right? I'm not thinking of the game in terms of like, I'm an energy corporation. I'm thinking of like energy cards are the way I'm going to win this game and beat my friends. So
min-maxing.
Yeah, you get into the min-maxing thing. I think at the end of the day, that's fine. There are games that, again, I like Terraforming Mars a lot. It's a fun game, but I wouldn't say it provides a lot of catharsis storytelling. In the video game world, you could look at the difference between like Diablo versus, I don't know, like Baldur's Gate. Baldur's Gate, I mean, has a really cool story when it came out. I remember playing as a kid. I played Diablo 2 as a kid as well, and Diablo is just min-maxing. There's not really much story. You're just, killing monsters and running around collecting loot. You do that as well in Baldur's Gate, but there's a whole narrative. Again, there's dialogue, there's character choices. You can, make decisions that influence the game. So how you balance that, I'm not sure. I do think that there's definitely a way. And I think that at the end of the day, just going back to focusing on theme is always, I think, where I would go as a storyteller, if I was involved in designing a game, and trying to find a way to keep the theme as present as possible and maybe set up the understanding with the players that, hey, this isn't so much about winning or losing, but this is about the experience of what you're gonna play. So I think maybe cooperative games could be more of a space that you can explore that. Competitive games where you're playing against other players might be a little harder because you get somebody like me who's competitive and I'm just thinking of my strategy. How do I want to win the game? The competitive aspect of games can really interfere and cause people to go into metagame thinking where they're not thinking as if they're actually in the game. They're just thinking of a way to win. I think one way around that a little bit is giving players choices of ways to win, because that's kind of a way they can make a choice, and you can relate it back to theme without having them, I guess, pick it just because it's a stronger strategy if you do a good game balancing. So like Viticulture is a game you and I both like, and there's different ways you can win. I don't think it's a good example of the way that the narrative is influenced by that, but I think that the mechanics of it open a door to see how that could work, because the mechanics are all pretty sound. Like there's not really one strategy that's too overpowered. They're all pretty balanced. And if you could tie I'm thinking how to word it, if you could tie the choice of how a player wants to win the game to the thematic storytelling aspect of the game, that could introduce a way for characters to make choices within the narrative, and it's not all just about, what's my best strategy, as long as it's well balanced. So if you want to win the game through being a pacifist, that says something maybe about your thematic choice within the game. If let's say the thematics involve a world at war, and it's really about, is war necessary? Or like, can the horrors of war truly be avoided? Let's say is the theme of the game or the story that you're trying to tell. Well, how the players win that game could be a big influence on the theme. Somebody could go, I'm going to go the pacifist route. I'm going to go the tyrant route. I'm going to go the defensive, neutral route of like, I'm not going to hurt you if you don't hurt me, but I'm going to be ready. There's all these kind of different ways that you can have a character explore the way they could win the game that still relates back to this thematic idea of, like I said, can the horrors of war truly ever be avoided? And players get to make choices, and that can reveal something about themselves, and it can, tie into the game better. So I think the path to victory could be a way to make the thematics play into the game more, giving players different avenues to win. And it's not so sandboxy, like you said, where it's like open world and people get bogged down, but it still gives them choices.
Yeah, Near and Far is definitely a very interesting game. I highly recommend it to people that would be watching. Definitely check it out. Just from a story aspect, I felt like it was lacking, and I'm going to juxtapose that with another game that was the exact opposite. So we'll start off in our base with Near and Far, Brian Lockett game. I have almost all the games. I enjoy his work. Near and Far story-wise, just couldn't quite come together, just because, as we've talked about, giving players too much autonomy within the game space. Mechanically speaking, it's a pretty solid game as far as I can remember. It's been a couple of years since I've played it, but I remember being like, this goes here, that does this, that plays this. You have these inner working systems, which is the more ludologist part of a game. You have your narratologist part and your ludologist, which is the actual interworkings and the mechanisms of how this works with this. So having said that, the juxtaposition is a game that I know I've talked about with Kevin and others on my channel, probably a little too much now at this point. It's a game by Hub Games called Holding On: The Troubled Life of Billy Kerr. Now, in The Troubled Life of Billy Kerr, or just Holding On, the story of the game is you are working at a hospital, you're managing a hospital, and Billy Kerr has just been rushed into your emergency unit. He has had a supermassive stroke on a plane from Sydney to LA, and they had to land somewhere else, and he's now in your hospital. He is suffering, he is dying, you have to take care of him. You have no clue who this person is. You want to try to reach out to his kin or family. You want to find out who this person is, and things like that. Absolutely great story. It's all about a character, this Billy Kerr guy. And when I say this with not a lot of pride, but at the resolution of that game, it's 10 games, when you get to the end of the 10th game, which is impossible to beat, but I cried. I did. I got emotional. Not open weeping, but I was so connected to this character in this because of the story. This Billy Kerr guy, as you go along, he gives you his story and he tells you about, this is what happened to me and this is where I was, and this is about my family and things and that. And it's all revolved around a certain time period or a period in history, which is called the Troubles. You guys can Google that if you want. That happened in a certain part of the world that was a terrible time. And you learn more about this guy. And at the end, you just go, wow, that, at least for me, I know some of the other players were just okay, well, I guess we're done now. But for me, I was like, that was a ride. Now, having said that, going back to the Far argument, Holding On, mechanically speaking, with the gameplay, is not very great at all. It gets bogged down in the samey kind of mechanics. It's a resource management game, essentially. You're trying to just use the resources you have for the day to make Billy comfortable, to make sure you have the staff to work the morning shift, the evening shift, the overnight, and cards come out that kind of mess with your plan. It is a cooperative game, so there you go. There's probably some way to what you're saying about cooperative games being a really way for people to have shared experiences to consume a story together than being competitive and trying to consume a story, because then you end up with that meta game and problems like that. And so the juxtaposition here is Near and Far, great game, story-wise, just had a lot of problems. Holding On, great game. Story was awesome for me anyways, but the gameplay, I could see bear down for, or get a lot of gamers to be like, I don't want to play this anymore. It's a lot of the same, and they don't offer up enough choices and enough varying gameplay. And so, as Alex was saying, there is probably a sweet spot there. I could probably list off of, a couple of mine. I'm a little more of the gamer heavy guy, I have the YouTube channel about narrative games. My bro plays some games like here and there. As he said, he's really like more of a strategic player. And so there are games that do that. And I'm just wondering, what are the limitations? I mean, what are the physical limitations? Do you think characters are important? Do you think that the mechanics are just as important as the narrative?
Yeah, so the character is super important. And I know there's a lot of writers that always emphasize character more than anything else.
I cried for this guy, man.
Yeah, and I think for me, character is a reflection of theme. So your characters are motivated by your theme, and they should be designed around your theme. So the stronger you can design your characters with that theme, the better the characters are going to be. And every writer has their own process. That's how my process works. I don't just create a character and then find a plot for them. I usually have a plot, and then I fill the characters in that are appropriate for that plot, or for that, thematics and all that kind of stuff. So yes, characters are super important at the end of the day for any story, because that's how we connect, us with other people through other people's experiences, and we're proxying ourselves into that character, right? I think the mechanics, there is a sweet spot, I think, but I think that there can be both sides. I think that there can be games that are more mechanic heavy and lighter on the storytelling and thematics, and still be great games, I think there are opportunities for games to improve their storytelling, probably in almost every arena, just by, like I said, kind of looking at narrative structure and trying to structure their games more with narrative in mind rather than just mechanics in mind. Like you said, you can come up with some great mechanics, great gameplay, but then, just ignore the storytelling parts. I think that's a mistake.
It feels tacked on.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, well, we just need a reason to have this mechanic, right? And I think that the same thing is true of games that are not mechanic heavy and are very story heavy, like you mentioned, before, with the RPG games going that route, limiting the amount of, pencil and paper, type stuff, min-maxing, all that kind of stuff, kind of throwing that out the window and just being like, hey, we're just going to focus more on the narrative and being able to explore the choices that you make as a character. So those are kind of two different extremes, right? And there's a sweet spot somewhere in between there, but I think both can learn from each other. And I think there's enough space for all kinds of games to exist. And I don't think people should throw a game out the window just because the storytelling isn't as strong as another game, because, the gameplay could still be very satisfying. And I think even within that, you could, make a few changes to games to provide better storytelling. It doesn't have to be some, master epic story, but just giving characters choices that reflect the theme and the world that they're in. It's just a good starting point, I think, for any game. I think one space, and this one thing I want to talk about a little bit that's interesting, is legacy games, which I know, you have played, I've played a little bit of. And legacy games are interesting because I think that they're, from the ones I've seen and a little bit I've played, they kind of, again, go more towards that mechanics aspect than they do the story aspect. So like I've played a bit of Betrayal Legacy and like Risk Legacy. And Betrayal is a really cool game because I think one of the limitations, I'll get back to the legacy mechanics here in a second, but with Betrayal, as far as narrative goes, I think they missed the boat a little bit from the times I've played, but there's so much possibility within that game for narrative because you have these different scenarios. You have hundreds of scenarios or whatever that you pick from. You don't pick from, but happen to you. So it's all random. And that's a great space because I think one of the problems with games and narrative is it becomes, there's some games that you're like, I'm going to play this once and then that's it, and that's great. But then there's not the replayability because the story, you already know what the story is. And there's only so many different paths the story can go, especially with like a board game where you have to have the mechanics kind of line up. And I think with Betrayal, what they did is really smart because you have constantly new scenarios that you're playing through, kind of every time you play almost. And what that means is that you could introduce different stories, different themes every single time if you built the world and the storytelling and the decision-making around that, because you're basically going, every time you play, you're going to be playing a different story. Game mechanics stay the same, but it's a whole new scenario, a whole new story, whole new decision tree, whole new theme. And that's where I think they got they got the idea of changing the scenario every time right, but they kind of missed the boat with the storytelling parts. And yeah, because it's kind of like, okay, well, it's just, different monster, different way of killing them, that kind of thing. And the decision making isn't really related to anything thematic and that kind of thing. So, but it's a really cool way to tell multiple different stories through one game and go through different types of themes in one game. So that's really, really cool idea, I think, that they had there, and could be explored by other game designers more if they want to explore the thematic possibilities of games more. But as far as legacy games go, I've seen a lot of legacy games where the legacy aspects of things that change and transition from one game to the next and keep kind of evolving are oftentimes more mechanical based than they are story based. So now this piece has a +1 on all your rolls. It's like, okay, cool. That doesn't really mean much for the thematics. You know what I mean? You're not really changing a lot of the outcome of the story, from what I've seen anyways. And I haven't played a ton of legacy games, so I'm sure there's some out there that are better than others. But I think that's a space with legacy games that can be explored. Again, going a little bit more towards that RPG element of the choices you make influence the rest of the story down the line. If you go down path A, it's going to lead to a whole new decision tree branch than if you went through path B, right? So yeah, that's one space I think that there's a lot of possibility. And like I said, I think different game design elements similar to Betrayal, where you can have multiple stories every game, or different stories every game that can explore different themes and different plots, is another really cool possibility to explore as well.
I'm right there with you with Betrayal Legacy. Alex did join in on my campaign, or my group's campaign of Betrayal Legacy, I think, twice?
Yeah,
maybe?
Once or twice. Yeah, twice, I think.
Twice. And so we did actually play Betrayal Legacy a little bit together, although the game does play over a lot more games than just twice. And I'm right on board with you there. The way that they differentiate or make the themes kind of distinct from game to game is great. I mean, that's what the base game did. And Alex, I do know, has played just the regular Betrayal game, just the base game. And there's a Baldur's Gate game as well that operates in the same way. So the individual kind of who's the flavor of the week or the bad guy of the week kind of thing was pretty good. What they tried to do, and this is the part that I loved the idea when I heard about it, is you're building the story of your house. For those of you who don't know, it's basically a haunted house game in which you're playing. Each game basically moves through time. It tells crazy things that happen in this house. So by the end of the game, you're at 2004, I believe. And you have this whole history of this house, of what's gone on. And so the overarching narrative of what they wanted to do with things, I think, fell really flat because you had too many of these little kind of things that's just like, okay, there's weirdness here and there's weirdness here. But it didn't have a theme, so to speak. And I'm using theme in your definition, not in the board game definition, world definition, about like those kind of choices and whatnot. What was the other one that you mentioned? I forget what else you
like Risk Legacy.
Risk Legacy is not so much of a narrative-driven game as it is just kind of choices. You can kind of make up your own. I mean, every game is a narrative game if you really apply yourself to it. And I've said this to people before, so I'll say it on this channel again. You can take a game Monopoly and you can play a game of Monopoly, and you can kind of come up with a story of you were a guy that bought this property that this happened to, and you can kind of construct a narrative about Monopoly. Is Monopoly a narrative game? No, it's a roll and move trash game, but you could do that. And Risk is kind of borrowing some of that, where you're kind of putting together a little bit of the story of our board as you play through, and the board changes. Certain events will happen and you'll open boxes just like any other legacy game. I've done a video about legacy games specifically if you want to check that out, and as far as how they work and things like that. And so Risk is kind of the first foray into the legacy world. One of the last things I kind of want to do here before we wrap up or whatever is I just want to talk about, have just kind of more of a fun discussion about games, narrative games in general. And so I guess I'll go first, kind of give you a little bit of time to think, I suppose, or whatever. If you want to just share about a narrative game that you like or an experience you've enjoyed or something that is germane to like what we've been talking about. And so what I'm going to pick is I'm going to pick some of the games because I have a little bit more of experience where I think, and obviously as Alex and I have been talking about, all of this is incredibly subjective, right? It's just a subjective video. It's two dudes like talking in different states. But what I think games where they kind of got the story and the mechanics right. One of them is I'm gonna start off with basically the ones that I thought got it kind of right, and then narrow it down to the ones that I think got it pretty dang right. So one that I think got it kind of right is a competitive worker placement game by Stonemaier Games called Charterstone, where you're basically placing stickers and building up your own charter, your own city. I thought some of the mechanics in there that follow the story, and there's some pretty cool, some pretty interesting things that you open up and do in that one. I thought that they got that relatively okay. What I would recommend for any viewers out there that are thinking like, oh, cool, stories, narratives, legacy, what is all this stuff? Good places for you to check out and try, and games to check out is I would start with any type of a storybook game, especially by Jerry Hawthorne, who works for Plaid Hat Games. So these are games called Stuffed Fables, Comonauts, and the new one is called Aftermath. These are great storybook games. Like I mentioned, Near and Far is a storybook game. These ones are really good to play where they offer story and they offer choices. And I think, again, subjectively, I think they did it pretty well. I have not played Aftermath. I have it sitting up. But I like his style and I like what he's been doing with his games. And Stuffed Fables is actually kind of for kids. So if you have families, I would say start there. Moving forward, where I think they really hit the sweet spot, and I'm going to be jumping on the Rob Daviau bandwagon here, as Alex has already mentioned him with Risk Legacy, is Pandemic Legacy Season 1 and Season 2. I think that these games are pretty much flawless. Again, in my opinion, when you hit certain narrative aspects, the game changes and will reflect what you're doing. You know, you'll have different actions. Everything makes sense. And it all serves the plot of the story. Gosh, I don't want to spoil anything, but there is in Season 1 especially, in both of them, but in Season 1, there's certain things where it's like, we're doing this, we're working on this, we're building up this, we're searching the city or the country to find these people in the city or to do this or whatever, and it all comes together. It just has a cohesive moment where it just works. For me, it works. And so that's kind of what I wanted to ramble about, is games that I think that got it kind of right, at least in my opinion. So Alex, before we send off, anything you want to share, any moment, gaming story, anything like that, games you played?
Well, one thing I'll say is that what you just mentioned is a good way to put it, and I maybe stumbled around it a little bit earlier talking about it, but that cohesive moment, that's what you want to try to aim for, I think, with a narrative in a game, is that moment where all these different things, the characters you're playing, the turning points within the plot, everything thematically comes back into one moment where it all goes, oh, you know, and it all kind of comes together. So that's really what you're looking for. Like in the film world, that would be like the climax of the film, where everything that's been building since the beginning of the film kind of comes together for that one moment. So that's a cool thing to keep in mind too, is looking for that cohesive moment within a game.
Yeah.
I think I'm not as much of a gamer. Yeah.
Brings everything gets all of a sudden just goes like this. That moment does this, and you're like, oh,
yeah, you
now
feel
everything
it, right?
makes sense. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
You have the aha moment, I guess.
Right. I'm not as big of a gamer as you. I play quite a few kind of designer games, I guess, with my friend Kevin. So one thing I want to say is I want to shout out to Kevin. Kevin, I'm going to beat you at Terraforming Mars and Machikoro next time we can play. Like I said, I like to be Yeah,
which is another legacy game. Macro Legacy. Check that one
oh,
out.
I didn't know they had that.
Yep, it's 2 thumbs up from me.
We have a bit of a rivalry with Machi Kuro because he always gets very angry because I tend to win a lot of that game. I don't know why. I'm pretty good at that
Well,
one.
get the legacy version, man. It kind of switches up the game, tells the
Yeah,
story.
gotta get through Risk first. We just started that. I think as far as games that I think got it right though, like I said, it's hard because I don't play as many board games as you, and I don't play as many of the cooperative ones. I'm usually more on the competitive player versus player side. But and I know this isn't a video game channel, but just talking about games in general. I think the last game I played that I was like, wow, like you said, like I had like an emotional reaction to the story. Is a video game called Pillars of Eternity, and it's kind of like the old Baldur's Gate video games. Everyone's played those, the isometric, top-down, 6-player party kind of games. And there's Pillars of Eternity 1, there's like an expansion, there's Pillars of Eternity 2, and Pillars of Eternity 2, I played, I don't know, maybe 2 years ago or something like that. Yeah, there was like a moment in the game where I was kind of, like emotional. I was tearing up a little bit. I was feeling it. Not to spoil anything, but you're kind of, as a character, your part of your soul is sucked away from you. And you're trying to go on this kind of quest to regain part of your soul that's been stripped from you. And there's a moment in the game where you do get reunited with yourself. And there's this whole kind of narrative thing with a dialogue with yourself of like, if you could look at yourself and talk to yourself, if part of you was stripped away and turned into another version of yourself, what would that conversation, what would that reuniting be? It's a really, really cool moment, in a game. And like I said, a lot of the narratives led up to that moment. It was kind of that aha moment, like you were talking about, where everything kind of came together. So I'll give a shout out to that one. That was the last game that I played. That was like, oh, that was really impactful. And there was a good moment there. But board game wise, like I said, I don't play as many that are story heavy because I do more of the competitive ones.
What about any role-playing moments, either as a DM or a player?
I think
going back in your history.
Yeah, I mean that was from a long time ago because I was like middle school. But I think one of the coolest moments, and this is very related to what we were talking to earlier about the idea of choice being a big strength that games have, is we did this campaign for D&D, and just the really rough, points of the plot is the characters ended up going through the Underdark and were traveling through with the Drow, the Drow Underdark cities and stuff like that, and they discovered this plot that the Drow were working with this like necromancing, to raise this army of the undead to attack the surface dwelling, elves. It's kind of like to take over the city and kind of wipe them out because they had this big grudge against the surface dwelling elves. And so they went through the Underdark and they discovered this plot, and then they go back to the Elvish city, the above ground, elves, and they don't tell anyone about it. They just kind of forgot about it. And so then, like a game or two later, there's this giant, massive siege of all these drow and undead creatures on this Elvish city, and they were like, "Oh man, we totally didn't even tell anyone that this was coming." And it was just a cool thing because the campaign went a direction because of the choices that they made, and it was reflected. The narrative changed because of what they did or didn't do. And it was just cool to see the reaction of like, yeah, that the choices you make actually do matter. Like you are a part of the story, you're making choices, and if you don't tell people that there's a massive siege about to come, no one's going to know, and you're going to have to play it out now. So that was, I don't know, I remember that moment being pretty cool just as a DM, being like, well, the narrative actually did impact them, in some way.
What do you think that the future is in store for like board games? I know a lot of, I guess I'll try to help you out by getting you started. Like a lot of narratives are going towards like subscription boxes with like serial killer type stuff where there's like a narrative that you get things in the mail and some robot out there is emailing your email address, like clues and stuff like that. So more interactive narratives, definitely like that, escape room type stories and stuff that you use like I mentioned Weave earlier, where you use your phone to kind of help implement the story. Do you see that's kind of where we're going, getting more techie with our games and apps and stuff?
I'm sure inevitably that is. It kind of just is a way for everything, right? Like everything's going that direction, no matter what direction you're looking. I think it's kind of a bummer. I like the if I'm going to play a board game, a tabletop game, I want it to be physical. I don't want to be on my phone. So I think that's one of the nice things. And you probably agree with this too, because we kind of share that feeling that people's phones are getting in the way of their life,
I did a
actually
video on
experiencing
it.
life. Yeah. So I like games that don't have that. I think it's okay to a certain degree, and there's, like I said, enough space for all kinds of games to exist, but I don't want all games to go that direction. I think being able to put your phones away and be across from someone and play with them directly and interact with physical, dice and cards and stuff like that is really great. One example of this is I play a lot of Magic the Gathering, which so I'm a pretty big Magic the Gathering nerd. I play tournaments and stuff. I can play online. I would rather go to a store and play because I like the physicality of the cards. I like playing with the paper cards, and I like playing with other people. The social aspect too. Seeing the same people every week. Talking, playing a great game, and shaking hands at the end or whatever. That's where I think there's a good value to be had there with gaming that you don't get if you're just playing with you. Everyone's staring at their phone, trying to figure out the next clue, or again, you're playing Magic online and you can barely even chat with the other person. You don't see them. It's just a game. There's no person on the other side of it at that point. But yeah, it's probably headed that direction,
Yeah. There's get your app out of my game. That's kind of my saying
Yeah.
for the whole thing. There are certain spaces for that. One video that, if anyone's watching this, any of my subscribers or whatever could check out, is I'm giving away a copy of Chronicles of Crime, which is a cool crime solving CSI board game that does have a little bit of a phone scanning cards type thing, interviewing people like that. And I think that works really great. And it's a really easy way to get people into the game. It's not super card heavy, since you're using your phone to just kind of like ask this person about this person, and it's really smooth and fast. And so, yeah, I do agree
I will
that
say
there.
I will say one more thing about the idea of technology within board games and physical, tabletop games that we're talking about, is I think there is a good argument to be made to use technology to help streamline some of the mechanics.
Yes.
So that's where I think there's benefits. For example, like D&D, there's a lot of rolling dice, adding, multiplying numbers, but then you play something like Pillars of Eternity, which is based off the D20 system. Well, every time one of your characters deals damage, the computer rolls the dice for you and does all the math, right? So I'm not sitting there spending hours rolling dice, for one little combat sequence. And I think that's where there's some benefit to technology being able to streamline the mechanics a bit.
Yeah, that was pretty much my summary of the whole get your app out of my game kind of thing. Is I've shared this story with some people before, and I'll share it very briefly before we kind of call it. There's a game that's set in the Lovecraftian universe called Mansions of Madness. So anyone knows the word Cthulhu or knows anything about that, it's in the Cthulhu world. And Mansions of Madness, the first edition came out. Now, granted, I didn't know that it was just the only edition. Again, it's a haunted house. You're laying tiles out. If you've played Betrayal, like we've talked about earlier, it's similar to that. It's a cooperative game where you have one player that sits out and acts as I forget what they call it, the overlord or something like that. That's basically controlling the house and all that stuff. So you have to have someone set up that's not really playing. And the setup on it was terrible. There was so much setup for it. There were like 5 different scenarios. You had to seed the decks a certain way. Card A had to go on top of card B, then C, then D. And, to make your story cohesive as far as what they would find when they would go to this room, if it was a locked door. If you messed up any of that, you messed up your whole game. And it took way too long. And when you went into a room, there was way too much, again, bookkeeping, like Alex was talking about with D&D, that just bogged the game down, took away from the narrative. Because, like I said, there are scenarios, so there's a story for each one of these that you do. And I did own the first edition, and I set it up a few times. I probably spent more time setting it up and making sure that everything was okay than I did actually like playing it or enjoying it for sure. And I ended up getting rid of it. I actually got rid of it compared to what I paid for it for very, very, very cheap because I was like, just take this thing off my hands because it's a burden. Jump to years later, they have the second edition. The second edition has an app in which everyone can play, and the app acts as the bookkeeper, like you were saying, with pillars. It's kind of takes care of everything for you. With this tile here, see this monster here. Okay, click next. Go to this monster, open it up, like look at its stats, apply damage to it. You're still playing on the board. You still have everything out here in front of you, but you're using a tablet or a computer or something to kind of click on, and it kind of is doing all the work for you. So that is really great. So you and I are both kind of the same mind when we're thinking about like the idea of streamlining. So Mansions of Madness second edition, absolutely love. It's in my collection. I'm keeping it. I do enjoy playing it. I can play it solo if I want. I can always download new content because there's like DLC scenarios, there's expansions. It's great. But I think there could be that, and I'm sure you would agree, there would be kind of an arbitrary, like, oh, this has an app, get your app out of my game. Like, I don't really need to be on my phone or have a screen in front of me if I don't really have to, if the game doesn't really need me to do it. So it's just one little quick story about, the future of games. Yes, apps are going to be a thing. They're going to streamline games. Chronicles of Crime, I play way more the Detective: A Modern Crime Story, although I think the latter is a better game, while Chronicles of Crime is a quicker, easier, introductory, moves faster, and again, Mansions of Madness and stuff like that. So there's always going to be apps like streamlining and changing the face of board games and how we feel. Let's just hope and pray and like cross our fingers that it just doesn't go all techie tech, which I hope it won't. I don't think it will. I think we'll have too many purists and maybe some younger generations coming up, really loving pushing those cubes and moving those wheels and rolling those dice and not having to just click on a tablet and stuff like that, and whatnot.
It'll be like the people that still listen to vinyl. There's just something about the sound of a vinyl record, right? Like,
yeah,
maybe it'll be the new hipster craze.
Yeah, all the hipsters love board games, and so. Anyways, so that's it for the video. Thanks everyone for watching. I want to thank my own brother, Alex Davidson, for joining me. Thank you. And we will call it a night and let you guys get back to your YouTube watching. So I'm Andrew Davidson. That's per my ability. Thank you for watching, and I will see you guys all at the next video.